How to become the undisputed king of Wall Street without starting from scratch. In the pantheon of American titans, the story of John Pierpont Morgan stands apart, a narrative defined not by the grit of invention, but by the gravity of inheritance. To become the undisputed king of Wall Street, you don't simply build, you inherit. This is the fundamental truth of J.P. Morgan, a man who, unlike his self-made contemporaries, such as the relentless John D. Rockefeller, who clawed his way to a monopoly from the chaotic oil fields, or Andrew Carnegie, who forged an empire from the fire of a single steel mill, was the anointed scion of an established and powerful financial dynasty. If you are finding this exploration into the world of high finance and unparalleled power as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to support our channel. These deep dives into history are made possible by viewers like you. Click that like button to let us know you appreciate the content. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new biography. And most importantly, share this video with anyone else who loves to understand the true stories behind the figures who shaped our world. Your support allows us to continue bringing these complex histories to life. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was not a mere banker. He was a transatlantic force, operating a formidable financial empire from the heart of London, the world's capital market. J.P. Morgan was therefore born into a world of immense, almost unimaginable wealth. And he was groomed from his earliest days not as a tradesman or an innovator, but as a future commander. His education, his connections, and his entire worldview were meticulously curated and bequeathed to him by his father. His destiny, as it was laid out for him, was not to create a new industry from scratch, but to seize control, to consolidate, and to impose order upon the ruinous competition he so despised. He would take the warring, fragmented industries of the Gilded Age, railroads, steel, electricity, and forge them into monolithic trusts. His power would grow so vast that he would eventually hold the very credit of the United States government in his hands, all of it built upon the unshakable foundation his father had laid. J.P. Morgan was groomed not merely as a successor, but as a financial statesman, a prince of capital. His father, Junius, orchestrated an education that was a masterpiece of strategic investment in human potential. He was not sent to American colleges, but to the finest, most exclusive schools in Europe, where the real power resided. He was dispatched to a private school in Switzerland to master French, the language of diplomacy and high culture, and then crucially to the prestigious University of Göttingen in Germany. This was not a finishing school. Göttingen was a world-renowned center for mathematics, a skill Junius deemed essential for the complex calculations of international finance. This continental education was designed to achieve two goals. First, to imbue his son with an intellectual rigor and a cosmopolitan air that would set him far above the rough-hewn American industrialists. Second, and more importantly, it was a networking imperative, meticulously designed to build personal connections with the scions of Europe's ancient banking elite, the Rothschilds, the Barings, the Warburgs. When J.P. returned as an apprentice in his father's London firm, Junius & Co., he wasn't taught to gamble on stocks. He learned the family's core business, a far more profound and stable enterprise, providing massive-scale capital to entire nations and fledgling corporations by underwriting foundational bonds. They didn't speculate on the market. They were the market, guaranteeing the sale of immense debt issues that funded wars, built railroads, and financed governments, taking their ironclad commission in the process. The core philosophy that drove J.P. Morgan for his entire life, the doctrine inherited from his father, and hardened by his own austere temperament, was that ruinous competition was a sin. This was not a moral judgment in the religious sense, but a financial one. He looked upon the wild, chaotic spectacle of Gilded Age capitalism not as a land of opportunity, but as a wasteful, inefficient, and dangerous anarchy that destabilized the entire system upon which his family's fortune was built. He saw brilliant but reckless industrialists at war, building redundant railroad lines parallel to each other, slashing prices to suicidal levels, and driving one another into bankruptcy, taking investors and small banks down with them. To Morgan, this was not business. It was madness. His life's work thus became a grand, messianic crusade to impose order on this chaos. He believed the only solution was centralization and control, forcing these warring companies into massive, consolidated trusts. These entities, which he would create and manage, would end the price wars, streamline operations, and guarantee stable profits for their investors, namely himself and his partners. He believed this power should be held by a small, elite group of financiers, with his firm, J.P. Morgan & Co., at its absolute center. This relentless, systematic process of forced consolidation would become feared, revered, and famously known as Morganization. His method for imposing this order was not one of gentle persuasion. It was a legendary, brutal, and psychological theater. Morgan understood that these robber barons and industrial titans were men of colossal ego, and they would not yield to polite requests. So he would use his ultimate leverage, capital. When warring companies were wounded, bleeding cash, and desperate for financing, he would invite their respective executives to his fortress-like library on Madison Avenue in New York. This was a summons, not a negotiation. The library itself was a weapon, a $1.2 million marble palace filled with priceless manuscripts, ancient art, and Renaissance tapestries, designed to awe and intimidate. He would bring the rivals into his study, famously lock the doors, put a key in his pocket, and shrouded in a cloud of cigar smoke, refused to let them leave. Hours, sometimes an entire day, would pass as these men argued, postured, and threatened, while Morgan sat like a silent, immovable sphinx. He would not let them out until they had agreed to merge, to cease their wasteful war, and to sign the papers he had already prepared. The terms were always unequivocally his. J.P. Morgan & Co. would manage the entire consolidation. It would take a colossal and non-negotiable fee for its services, and, most critically, it would place its own partners, men like George Perkins, on the new company's board of directors to ensure Morgan approved. Management, fiscal discipline, and above all, the end of competition. The 19th century railroad industry exemplified the very chaos that J.P. Morgan so thoroughly despised. It was the transformative technology of its day, the Internet of the 19th century, connecting a vast continent and creating unprecedented wealth. But it was also suicidally chaotic. Robber barons, fueled by speculation and government subsidies, built tracks with reckless abandon. They laid redundant lines, often to the same small towns, not to serve customers but purely to engage in rate wars with rivals. They would slash shipping prices to levels far below their operating costs, a game of chicken designed to see who would go bankrupt first. This wild speculation created a constantly inflating and bursting bubble, which threatened the entire national economy. This instability of the railroad system, the arteries of the American economy, put dependent farmers and banks at constant risk of collapse. Farmers in the Midwest found their crops rotting because the local line had gone insolvent. Small-town banks that had invested heavily in that line's bonds collapsed overnight, wiping out the savings of entire communities. The instability of this single industry, the nation's most important, put everyone at constant risk of financial collapse. And it was this systemic risk that Morgan found so intolerable, not just as a banker, but as a man pathologically obsessed with order. He saw it as his duty to tame this beast, not for the public good necessarily, but for the good of the capital system he represented. Morgan applied his philosophy of Morganization to this railroad chaos in a patient, systematic, and decades-long campaign. He knew he could not tame the entire industry at once. He began in the 1880s by targeting the most powerful and destructive rivalries. In a famous incident, he brokered a peace treaty between the warring New York Central, controlled by the Vanderbilts, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. He invited the presidents of both lines onto his yacht, the Corsair, and essentially held them captive on the Hudson River until they agreed to stabilize rates and stop their destructive competition. This set the precedent. Morgan was the arbiter, the supreme judge who could force peace for the sake of profit. But his true opportunity came after the devastating panic of 1893, a financial crisis that bankrupted a staggering 1/4 of all U.S. railroads. With so many lines insolvent and desperate for capital, his power became absolute. He was the only man with the access to European capital necessary for such a massive reorganization. He took control of numerous failed lines, including the Erie Railroad and the Northern Pacific. His process was ruthless. He slashed their massive debts, forced bondholders to accept significant losses, and imposed brutal cost-cutting measures. In exchange for this life-saving capital, he placed his own men on their boards. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan was no longer just a banker. He was the de facto traffic cop of American commerce, controlling thousands of miles of track and dictating the terms by which goods moved across the continent. The War of Currents, in the 1880s and 1890s, was a vicious, high-stakes, and technologically profound battle between two geniuses and their competing visions for the future. On one side was the celebrated Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, who championed direct current, DC. DC was relatively safe and worked well for his incandescent light bulb, but it was inefficient, difficult to transmit over long distances, and required a power station every mile or so. On the other side was the eccentric visionary Nikola Tesla, whose brilliant patents for alternating current, AC, were backed by the industrialist George Westinghouse. AC could be stepped up to high voltages, sent efficiently over hundreds of miles with minimal loss, and then stepped down for consumer use, making a national power grid possible. But its high voltages made it seem, to the public, far more dangerous. The public relations war was one of the most brutal in corporate history. Edison, desperate to protect his DC empire, launched a smear campaign with his allies, including Harold P. Brown, publicly electrocuting stray dogs, cats, and even a circus elephant named Topsy, all using Westinghouse's AC, to prove it was the killer current. They even successfully lobbied for AC to be used in the world's first electric chair, forever associating it in the public mind with death. J.P. Morgan, who had been an early and significant financial backer of Thomas Edison, watched this war of currents with growing impatience. He saw this ruinous competition not as a fascinating scientific debate, but as a chaotic and wasteful spectacle that was terrible for business. It confused the public, terrified potential investors, and slowed the adoption of electricity, costing his primary investment, Edison General Electric, a fortune in protracted legal battles and lost contracts. As a banker, Morgan's ultimate allegiance was not to Edison's genius or to technological superiority. It was to an orderly, predictable, and above all, profitable market. He recognized that Westinghouse and Tesla's AC technology, despite the bad press, was the superior system for building a scalable national electrical grid. He decided to end the war in the only way he knew how, by consolidating it. He orchestrated a financial takeover, leveraging his immense capital to force a merger. In 1892, he consolidated Edison General Electric with its primary AC patent-holding rival, Thomson-Houston. In this new, all-powerful entity, simply named General Electric, Thomas Edison himself was marginalized and effectively forced out, his name removed from the company he created. Morgan, the banker, had ended the war, seized control of both competing technologies, and created an unassailable electrical trust, which he, of course, controlled. It was a perfect example of his core belief that the market was too important to be left to the whims of inventors and competitors. In 1893, the United States of America, as a sovereign entity, teetered on the brink of financial collapse. The crisis was born of a disastrous piece of legislation, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which forced the U.S. Treasury to buy millions of ounces of silver bullion every month with gold-backed paper notes. As the value of silver plummeted on the world market, smart investors and foreign governments began a relentless run on the U.S. Treasury. They would exchange these paper notes en masse for gold, draining the nation's reserves. This, combined with the bursting of a massive railroad bubble, which Morgan had long predicted, caused a catastrophic crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar. Fearing the U.S. would abandon the gold standard and devalue its currency, investors scrambled to pull their gold out. By early 1895, the nation's gold reserve had fallen below the symbolic $100 million mark and was evaporating daily. The United States was mere days away from defaulting on its debt, an event that would have shattered its economy, rendered its currency worthless, and plunged it into a deep depression. With President Grover Cleveland and the U.S. government paralyzed and powerless, J.P. Morgan stepped in. This was not an act of pure patriotism. It was an act of profound self-preservation, as a U.S. default would have destroyed his own firm and the entire Western financial system. He assembled a private syndicate of American and European bankers, including the powerful Rothschilds, and traveled to Washington for a direct confrontation with the president. He explained that the government was leaking gold and that he was the only man who could stop it. Using a legal loophole from a Civil War-era statute, Morgan proposed that his private syndicate would sell $65 million in gold, worth over $2 billion today, directly to the U.S. government. In exchange for this gold, the syndicate would receive 30-year government bonds at a favorable interest rate, which they would then resell. President Cleveland, who deeply distrusted Morgan and Wall Street, was trapped and had no choice but to agree. Morgan's syndicate plugged the hole, reselling the bonds for a massive and immediate profit. J.P. Morgan had personally saved the nation from default, but the public was outraged. The episode confirmed their deepest fears. A single, unelected private banker was more powerful than the United States government itself, and he had profited handsomely from the nation's desperation. To create the first billion-dollar company, you don't build, you consolidate. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan was already a titan of the steel industry, having bundled several smaller companies into his own Federal Steel Trust. But he faced one colossal obstacle: Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, a brilliant, self-made Scottish immigrant, was the most efficient and innovative steel producer in the world. He embodied the very ruinous competition that Morgan hated. And in 1900, Carnegie was threatening to build massive new plants and launch a new devastating price war that would likely bankrupt Morgan's less efficient Federal Steel. Morgan knew he could not win such a war against Carnegie. However, he also knew that Carnegie was old, increasingly tired of the brutal fight of business, and desperate to retire into full-time philanthropy, to give away the fortune he had amassed. Carnegie, the man who was Morgan's single greatest problem, was simultaneously his single greatest opportunity. Morgan needed to buy him out, but the price would be staggering. In the winter of 1901, the deal of the century was struck, not in a boardroom, but with characteristic subtlety. Morgan's trusted lieutenant, Charles Schwab, arranged a dinner and a game of golf with Andrew Carnegie. The conversation was not about mergers, but about retirement, about legacy, about what Carnegie truly wanted to do with his remaining years. Sensing the opening, Schwab pressed the issue, and Carnegie, famously, scribbled his price on a simple slip of paper. $480 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, equivalent to over $15 billion today. Schwab took the paper to Morgan. Morgan, the man who despised gambling but understood power, glanced at the number and, without hesitation, uttered his famous curt reply, "I accept." With that, he bought Carnegie's entire industrial empire. But he didn't stop there. He immediately moved to consolidate the entire industry. He merged Carnegie Steel with his own Federal Steel, along with Elbert Gary's National Steel and other major players. The result, unveiled in 1901, was United States Steel. It was capitalized at $1.4 billion, making it the world's first-ever billion-dollar corporation. It was larger than the entire U.S. federal budget. U.S. Steel controlled over 60% of all American steel production, from the iron ore mines of Minnesota to the railroads that carried the ore to the mills in Pittsburgh. This was the absolute apex of Morganization and of J.P. Morgan's power. He had, in a single transaction, eliminated his greatest competitor and created a monopoly that would dominate the 20th century. The age of J.P. Morgan's unchecked absolute power, an age where he could create monopolies at will and bail out the government, was about to meet its match. The Gilded Age, which had been characterized by compliant pro-business presidents like William McKinley, who saw men like Morgan as partners, ended abruptly and violently. Just months after the creation of U.S. Steel, President McKinley was assassinated in September 1901. His vice president, a man the party bosses had tried to bury in that useless office, was suddenly thrust into the presidency. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. TRD was, in many ways, just like Morgan, a wealthy, Harvard-educated New York aristocrat. But in his worldview, he was Morgan's polar opposite. Roosevelt was a fire-breathing progressive reformer, a moralist who believed that corporations must be subservient to the public good. He saw the presidency not as a managerial position, but as a bully pulpit. And he was fiercely determined to prove to Morgan and the world that the United States government, not a cabal of New York bankers, was the nation's true and only sovereign. Theodore Roosevelt was the antithesis of any president J.P. Morgan had ever known. He was young, dynamic, charismatic, and a brilliant, instinctive user of the new media of mass circulation newspapers. He crafted a public persona as a man of the people, a cowboy, a soldier, and a reformer, all while being a blue-blooded aristocrat. He was not a socialist. He did not want to destroy capitalism or break up all large corporations. Instead, he made a crucial and novel distinction. He believed there were good trusts, which were efficient and beneficial to the public, and bad trusts, which were predatory, monopolistic, and existed only to stifle competition and gouge consumers. Crucially, Roosevelt believed it was the government's role, and his role as president, to be the judge of which was which, a role J.P. Morgan had reserved for himself. To prove this new doctrine, TR knew he needed a powerful test case. He needed to reactivate the long-dormant Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and use it to slay a giant. He needed a large, symbolic, and unambiguous target, and he set his sights on J.P. Morgan's newest and most audacious creation. The stage was set for a battle between two of the most powerful men in the country, a fight for the very soul of the American economy. This was a bout for the soul of the American economy, a heavyweight championship fight, the U.S. president versus the president of Wall Street. In 1902, Roosevelt's Attorney General, Philander Knox, stunned the nation by announcing a lawsuit against the Northern Securities Company. This entity was a trust of trusts, a massive railroad holding company created by J.P. Morgan, in partnership with his rival E. H. Harriman and the railroad baron James J. Hill, to control all rail traffic in the American Northwest. It was the very epitome of Morganization, a consolidation created to end a costly railroad war. To Roosevelt, it was an open and shut case of an illegal monopoly, a conspiracy in restraint of trade. Morgan, who had just recently been at the White House and had helped Roosevelt personally settle a major national coal strike, felt completely blindsided and betrayed. He saw the lawsuit as an act of profound ingratitude and a direct assault on his right to do business. J.P. Morgan was furious. The man who had personally saved the U.S. Treasury from collapse was now being sued by it. He did what he had always done. He traveled to Washington for a personal confrontation, assuming he could fix the problem by talking to the man at the top. He marched into the White House and, in a moment of stunning arrogance that revealed his entire worldview, he arrogantly told President Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man, and they can fix it up." Roosevelt was floored. Morgan was treating the President of the United States as a rival CEO, and the Attorney General as just another corporate lawyer. It was as if two corporations had a dispute. Roosevelt, offended and resolute, coldly replied that they could not fix it up, and that the suit would proceed. Morgan had fundamentally misjudged the man and the office. The battle raged in the courts for 2 years, but in 1904, in the landmark Northern Securities Comerviva United States case, the Supreme Court sided with Roosevelt in a 5-4 decision, ordering the company to be dissolved. It was the first time the Sherman Act had been used to break a major trust, and it was J.P. Morgan's first great humiliating public defeat. The trustbuster was born, and the rules of the game had changed forever. The federal government had proven it was, in fact, sovereign. Checked by the new power of the federal government and finding his absolute control over the industrial world, challenged by Roosevelt's reforms, J.P. Morgan turned his colossal energy, his obsessive-compulsive need for order, and his bottomless checkbook to the art world. This was no gentle, retiring hobby. It was a conquest. He pursued the acquisition of art with the same ruthless, systematic, and overwhelming zeal that he had applied to railroads and steel. In his last decade, his collecting became a titanic enterprise, an act of Morganization applied to culture itself. He was not just buying art. He was attempting, with startling success, to acquire the entire cultural heritage of Europe and transport it, piece by piece, to America. He sought to establish New York as the new Rome, the new center of Western civilization, and his collection would be its Vatican. He became, without question, the world's greatest art collector, spending unimaginable fortunes that dwarfed the national budgets of smaller countries. His agents, led by the formidable Belle de Costa Green, scoured Europe like an occupying army, buying not just individual pieces but entire collections from impoverished aristocrats and cash-strapped monasteries. He acquired priceless foundational items of Western culture, illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, 3 of the remaining Gutenberg Bibles paintings by old masters like Raphael, Rembrandt, and Rubens' ancient sculptures from Rome and Egypt, and vast priceless medieval tapestries. He cornered the market on entire categories of art. He built a collection so vast and so important that it truly rivaled the holdings of the Louvre or the British Museum. He housed these treasures in the Morgan Library, a 1.2 million Italian Renaissance-style marble palace built next to his home. A building that was not a home but a vault, a fortress and a personal museum to house the world's treasures. This act of cultural acquisition was his final, great consolidation, a way of imposing his will not just on the economy, but on history itself. In 1907, the American economy, a chaotic Wild West system that Morgan had tried and failed to completely tame, once again faced total collapse. The critical flaw remained. The United States, unlike every other major Western power, had no central bank to act as a lender of last resort. The nation's money supply was inelastic, and its banking system was a fragmented, unregulated network of thousands of independent banks and trust companies. That October, a failed attempt by a speculator named F. Augustus Heinze to corner the stock of the United Copper Market caused a small bank he was associated with to fail. This, in turn, exposed the risky practices of the Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest and most prominent financial institutions in New York. It was, in modern terms, the Lehman Brothers of its day. A crisis of confidence began to brew as depositors grew nervous about the Knickerbocker's stability. The spark that ignited the full-blown panic came, ironically, from the Morgan banking network itself. On October 21st, the Morgan-controlled National Bank of Commerce announced it would stop clearing checks for the Knickerbocker Trust, a public declaration of no confidence that was tantamount to a death sentence. The next day, October 22nd, a massive run on the Knickerbocker began. Thousands of depositors lined up demanding their money. Within hours, the Knickerbocker had suspended payment and closed its doors. This single failure shattered public confidence across the entire system. The panic went viral. Depositors began pulling their money from healthy banks, fearing they would be next. The stock market crashed, with shares becoming almost unsellable as liquidity evaporated. The U.S. government was utterly powerless. The Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, rushed to New York, but he did not come with a solution. He came with the nation as reserves to see the only man who had the power and knowledge to deploy them, J.P. Morgan. The man the government had just prosecuted as a menace was now its only hope. One private citizen, 70 years old, suffering from gout and in ill health, became the U.S. government. J.P. Morgan was called back from semi-retirement, where he had been attending a convention, and for 2 agonizing weeks, he acted as the de facto U.S. central bank, financial dictator, and economic savior. His magnificent library, the same room where he broke industrialists, became the financial command center for the entire country. He knew the panic was not a crisis of insolvency. Most banks were sound, but a crisis of confidence and liquidity. He immediately summoned all of New York's top bankers, including his bitter rivals and the deputies of John D. Rockefeller, to an emergency all-night meeting. He knew they were competitors who would rather watch a rival burn than risk their own capital. His goal was to force them to pledge a massive unified rescue fund. In one of the most dramatic scenes in American financial history, the assembled bankers argued, hesitated, and bickered for hours, each afraid to risk his own firm's capital to save his rivals. Morgan, growing increasingly furious at their short-sightedness and selfishness, finally exploded. He locked the library doors, trapping the most powerful men in America inside. He informed them, in no uncertain terms, that they would all survive together, or they would all fail together, and that he would not let them leave until they agreed to save the system. He demanded they pledge their fortunes to a $25 million rescue fund, billions today, which would be used entirely at his discretion. Trapped by his unbending will, his towering reputation, and the sheer terror of the unfolding collapse, they capitulated one by one, signing the agreement he had prepared. The Morgan Collective was formed, a private central bank with Morgan as its chairman, created in a single night of financial terror and brute force negotiation. For the next 2 weeks, J.P. Morgan and his trusted team, working day and night from the library, became economic dictators, conducting financial triage. Morgan personally managed the rescue fund. He dispatched teams of his Morgan men to go from bank to bank, auditing their books in real time. He would personally decide which banks were solvent and would be saved with infusions of cash, and which were insolvent and would be cut loose to fail. He funneled millions to the New York Stock Exchange, which was minutes from closing, to keep it afloat and prevent a total market seizure. In a brilliant move, he also orchestrated a rescue of a major brokerage firm by having his U.S. Steel acquire its failing rival, the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, TC&I, to prevent a new wave of panic. He first cleared this monopolistic move with President Roosevelt, who, trapped by the crisis, had to promise not to prosecute the deal under the Antitrust Act he had championed. J.P. Morgan stopped the panic. By pooling the banking system's resources, forcing cooperation, and projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence, he restored faith. The bank run slowed, and then stopped. He had, single-handedly, saved the American economy from a catastrophic depression. It was his final, and his greatest, act of power. But this absolute triumph came with a chilling, terrifying revelation for the American public and for Congress. The entire financial system, the fate of the nation, rested in the hands of a single, unelected, and accountable private citizen. What if Morgan had been on vacation? What if he had died? What if he had chosen to let his rivals fail? The money trust conspiracy that populists had warned about for decades was not a theory. It was a 70-year-old man in a library. This realization, more than any other event, would directly lead to the end of the very system that had allowed Morgan to exist, a system he had both dominated and, in its final days, saved. After the dust settled from the 1907 panic, a terrified and humbled Congress asked the fundamental question: who really runs this country? The answer, a single banker in New York, was democratically unacceptable. This realization led directly to investigations into the money trust. The Pujo Committee, formed in 1912, and led by the brilliant and aggressive counsel Samuel Untermyer, was mandated to prove that J.P. Morgan and a small cabal of affiliated bankers, like those at National City Bank and First National Bank, held a functional monopoly over the nation's finances, industries, and railroads through a vast interlocking network of directorships. In 1912, a 74-year-old sick and deeply offended J.P. Morgan was summoned to Washington. He was effectively put on trial, forced to testify before politicians he viewed with utter contempt. For 2 days, Samuel Untermyer grilled the aging titan, listing the staggering scope of his power. His partners held 341 directorships in 112 different corporations, controlling a combined $22.5 billion in assets, a sum more than double the entire national debt of the United States at the time. Morgan was defiant, dismissive, and arrogant, treating the politicians as ignorant gnats, incapable of understanding the complex systems he managed. In the evenings, after his grueling testimony, he would calmly return to his hotel and play solitaire, a public gesture of his unbothered contempt for the entire proceeding. He saw the investigation not as a legitimate exercise of democratic oversight, but as an impertinent and ignorant assault by lesser men on a system they were not qualified to question. His arrogance, even on trial, was boundless. During the hearing, Untermyer tried to trap Morgan into admitting that his immense power was based on his control of money and collateral. He pressed him, asking, "Is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property?" Morgan, seeing his opening, leaned forward and, in a moment of pure arrogance that was also his most profound philosophical statement, gave his most famous, revealing quote. He was about to define the entire Morgan worldview, the philosophy that had guided his every action, from his earliest days to this final, public confrontation.